When 17-year-old Caleb Driscoll walked across the stage at his high school graduation and scanned the auditorium with the practiced calm of someone who had learned never to expect anyone to show up, he was already telling himself it didn't matter. He had been telling himself that his whole life. It was the story he'd rehearsed in 11 different bedrooms across 11 different homes, the story that had kept him functional when other kids his age were still learning how to tie their shoes, and someone was there to watch them do it. It didn't matter that the chairs were full of families who had driven hours, who had ironed their good clothes, who had cried at the rehearsal the night before just thinking about it. It didn't matter that every single other graduate had at least one person in those seats who belonged to them. Caleb Driscoll had learned early and completely that belonging was something that happened to other people. What happened next, in a high school gymnasium in rural Tennessee on a warm Thursday evening in late May, would take that story he'd been telling himself for 17 years and burn it to the ground. Because the front row of that auditorium was not empty. It was full, it was loud, it was leather and patches and men who had driven from 4 different counties on motorcycles because a high school counselor had made one phone call to the right person and the right person had made 17 more. Before any of that, though, you have to understand who Caleb was. Not the version of him that the state of Tennessee had on file, not the case number with the updated addresses and the placement transfer reports. The real version, the one that existed behind eyes that had gotten very good at not showing too much. Caleb had entered the foster care system at age 4 when his mother, a woman named Donna, who had loved him in the fragmented, desperate way that people love things they cannot hold on to, lost her battle with addiction and her parental rights in the same week. His father was a name on a form that had never been located. From age 4 to age 17, Caleb moved. That was the dominant fact of his life. He moved the way weather moves, not by choice, but by force, pushed from one placement to the next by a combination of circumstances that were never really about him and always entirely about him. He was not a difficult child. That was the detail that hurt most when his counselor said it, as though the absence of a reason made the leaving worse. He was quiet. He was smart. He read everything he could get his hands on and retained it with the unsettling precision of someone who had learned that books did not leave. He made decent grades even when he was changing schools mid-semester, even when he was sleeping in a house where he didn't know where they kept the spare towels, even when the background noise of his life was a constant low-frequency hum of instability that never quite resolved into silence. He had been in 11 placements by the time he was 17. Some of them had been decent people stretched too thin. Some of them had been genuinely good people who lost jobs or got sick, or had their own family crises that had nothing to do with the quiet boy with the library books who slept in the second bedroom. One of them had been a situation the state had removed him from in a hurry and never fully explained. Caleb had stopped asking for explanations around age 9. He'd stopped unpacking his bags completely around age 10. By age 12, he had developed what his school counselor, a woman named Margaret Holloway, who had been watching him for 3 years, described in her notes as a self-sufficiency that was both impressive and heartbreaking in equal measure. She meant that Caleb had learned to need nothing from anyone in a way that kept him alive but was slowly teaching him that he was not the kind of person who got to be needed back. He arrived at his 11th and final foster placement at age 15, a house on the edge of a small town called Hartfield, Tennessee, belonging to a couple named Roy and Connie Briggs. Roy worked at an automotive shop. Connie worked at the elementary school as a paraprofessional. They had been fostering for 6 years and had had 14 kids come through their home, some for days, some for nearly a year. They were not young, and they were not idealistic, and they were not trying to save anyone. They were the kind of people who showed up because showing up was what they did, who kept the second bedroom ready because as long as they were able, some kid was going to need it. Caleb did not trust them immediately. He did not trust anyone immediately. But Roy Briggs had a quality that Caleb had not encountered in predictable quantities before, which was patience with no performance attached to it. Roy didn't try to be Caleb's father. He didn't try to be his friend. He just made sure there was food in the kitchen and that the Wi-Fi password was written on a piece of paper on the refrigerator and that the bathroom lights stayed on at night, and he asked exactly 0 questions that Caleb wasn't ready to answer. It was Roy who had the motorcycles, 2 of them parked in the garage beside the automotive tools, a big touring bike and an older cruiser that he was perpetually in the middle of restoring. Caleb had walked into that garage on his third day at the Briggs house and stood in the doorway watching Roy work, and Roy had looked up and said, "Hand me that 3/8 socket," and Caleb had found it without being told twice where to look. That was how it started, not with a conversation about feelings or a structured introduction to a hobby, with a socket wrench and a carburetor and two people who communicated more easily through problems that had solutions than through emotions that didn't. By the end of the first month, Caleb knew the difference between a valve adjustment and a timing issue. By the end of the third month, he had helped Roy get the old cruiser running for the first time in 2 years. The night it started, Roy sat back on his heels in the garage with the sound of that engine turning over between them and said, "Not bad, kid." 2 words. Caleb thought about those 2 words for a week. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. Because this story is proof that family doesn't always look the way you expect it to. And we want to know where in the world it's finding you today. Roy Briggs was a member of a motorcycle club called the Cumberland Road Brotherhood, a chapter based out of a town called Elmore, about 30 miles from Hartfield. He wasn't the president, and he wasn't the road captain, and he didn't wear his membership like a statement. He rode on weekends when he could, attended the meetings, helped with the charity runs, and came home on Sunday afternoons smelling like highway and engine heat. He had never brought the club home because he had never felt the need to. The Briggs house was its own quiet world, and Roy kept those 2 worlds respectfully separate, the way a man keeps the parts of himself that don't need to touch each other from touching. Connie Briggs noticed things about Caleb that Roy expressed differently. She noticed that he flinched slightly when doors slammed, not dramatically, but enough. She noticed that he ate quickly in the first weeks, the compact, efficient eating of someone who had learned that food on a plate was not necessarily food that would still be there in 10 minutes. She noticed that he never asked for anything, and that this absence of asking was not contentment, but a trained reflex, an adaptation so deep it had stopped feeling like a choice. She started leaving things out. An extra sandwich in the refrigerator with a note that just said "for whenever." A paperback she'd found at the library sale on the kitchen counter. Nothing that required Caleb to ask. Nothing that required him to be grateful out loud. Just things that appeared, the way Roy's patience appeared, without conditions attached. Margaret Holloway, the school counselor, had been tracking Caleb's file since he transferred into Hartfield High at the beginning of junior year. She had seen the placement history, and she had done what experienced school counselors do, which is calibrate their concern carefully, because kids who have been moved 11 times have very sensitive instruments for detecting pity, and they respond to it like animals respond to a trap, with retreat. She gave Caleb space, and she gave him access, and she made sure his teachers understood that inconsistency in his academic record was circumstantial, not indicative. And she watched him with the quiet attention of someone waiting for the right moment to say something that actually mattered. That moment came in February of his senior year, on a Tuesday afternoon when Caleb stopped by her office, not because he'd been sent there, but because he had a question about the graduation ceremony. Specifically, he wanted to know whether it was required that families be listed in the program or whether it was possible to leave that section blank. Margaret looked at him for a moment. At this 17-year-old with his careful eyes and his already old way of carrying himself, and she said, "There's no requirement." He nodded and turned to leave, and she said, "Caleb, is there anyone you'd want there?" And he said, without turning back around, "I don't want to make a big deal about it. It's fine." And then he left. Margaret Holloway sat at her desk for a long time after that. She had a philosophy she had developed over 22 years in school counseling, which was that the kids who said it's fine were the ones who needed the most, not the ones who acted out, not the ones who demanded, but the ones who had decided that wanting things was a luxury they couldn't afford. She pulled up Caleb's emergency contact form, which listed Roy and Connie Briggs. She had met Roy once, at a parent-teacher night, and she remembered him as a quiet man with calloused hands and patches on his jacket, who had asked intelligent questions about Caleb's AP English coursework and shaken her hand firmly on the way out. She remembered one of those patches, Cumberland Road Brotherhood. She looked it up. She found a contact number. She made a phone call on a Wednesday afternoon, that she would later describe as the most important administrative decision of her professional career. She reached a man named Gerald, who went by the road name Deacon, and who served as the Cumberland Road Brotherhood's community liaison, a role the club had created specifically because their community outreach work had grown to the point where someone needed to manage it. Gerald Deacon Crawford was 53 years old, a former middle school vice principal who had spent the second half of his life on two wheels and had never fully left behind the instinct to show up for kids who needed someone to show up. Margaret explained the situation in plain terms. She described Caleb without dramatizing him. She said, "There's a young man graduating in May who has been in foster care since he was 4 years old and has never had a single person come to anything. And I don't think he believes that's going to change. And I'm asking if your club would be willing to change it." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Not a long one. Then Gerald Crawford said, "What's his name?" Margaret told him. Gerald said, "When's the graduation?" Margaret told him. Gerald said, "We'll be there." He did not ask how many seats were available. He did not ask for more information. He asked for the name and the date, and then he said they would be there, with the flat certainty of a man who had learned that some commitments required nothing more than making them. What happened between that phone call in February and the third Thursday of May is a story that unfolded the way good things sometimes unfold, quietly and without announcement, in the margins of ordinary life. Gerald Crawford hung up the phone after speaking with Margaret Holloway and sat for a moment in the small office he kept at the back of the Cumberland Road Brotherhood Clubhouse, a converted auto shop on the edge of Elmore that smelled like motor oil and old coffee, and the particular kind of permanence that comes from a group of people who have decided to stay. He thought about what the counselor had told him. 11 placements, 17 years old, never had anyone come to anything. He turned those facts over in his mind the way you turn over something you found on the ground, checking it from every angle to make sure you understand what you're holding. Then he picked up his phone and started making calls. The first call went to the chapter president, a man named Thomas Brixton, known universally as Brix, who was 61 years old and had the measured authority of someone who had earned every gray hair on his head and knew exactly what each one had cost him. Brix listened to the full story without interrupting, which was his habit, and when Gerald finished, Brix said, "Front row." Gerald said, "That's what I was thinking." Brix said, "I'll make some calls to the other chapters." Gerald said, "I was thinking the same thing." That was the entirety of the strategic discussion. Two men who had been doing community work long enough to know that sometimes the plan was simply to show up and show up completely. The second call went to Roy Briggs. This was the call that required the most care because Roy was in a delicate position. He was Caleb's foster father, which meant he was both the person most qualified to help coordinate this and the person most likely to accidentally reveal to Caleb that something was being planned. Roy picked up on the second ring and listened to Gerald without speaking. And when Gerald finished, Roy was quiet for long enough that Gerald thought the call might have dropped. Then Roy said, in the flat voice of a man working very hard to keep his voice flat, "I didn't know you could do something like this." Gerald said, "That's why I'm calling." Roy said, "He doesn't know anyone's coming." Gerald said, "That's the point." Roy said, "Okay." Another pause. Then, softer, "Thank you." Gerald said, "Thank Roy. You're the one who kept the light on for him." Roy didn't respond to that, but Gerald heard him clear his throat in the way that men clear their throats when they are feeling something they have not given themselves permission to feel out loud. Roy hung up the phone and stood in his garage for a while. The old cruiser that he and Caleb had restored together was parked against the wall, gleaming under the fluorescent light with the quiet pride of something brought back from the edge of uselessness. Roy looked at it for a long time. Connie found him there 20 minutes later and knew from the set of his shoulders that something had happened. He told her about the phone call, and she sat down on the workbench stool and listened, and when he finished, she pressed her hand flat against her sternum the way she did when something hit her in a place she hadn't been expecting. She said, "He can't know," Roy said. "He won't hear it from us." She said, "Roy?" He looked at her. She said, "That boy deserves this so much." Roy nodded and looked back at the cruiser and said, "Yeah, one word." But the weight behind it was the weight of 2 years of watching a kid learn to trust in increments so small they were almost invisible, and knowing that what was coming in May was going to matter in ways that Caleb Driscoll would not have the vocabulary for until he was much older and looking back. The organizing spread through the Cumberland Road Brotherhood's network the way information spreads through a community that has practiced caring about things, which is to say, quickly and without bureaucracy. Gerald reached out to 3 other chapters within the first week: the Smokies chapter, the River Bend chapter, and a smaller group called the Ridgeline Riders, who weren't formally affiliated but had collaborated with the Brotherhood on charity work for years. Each chapter president heard the same story, and each of them responded with some version of the same answer, which was a variation on "we'll be there." No one asked whether it was convenient. No one asked whether there would be parking for motorcycles. No one asked what they would get out of it. If you believe that communities built on brotherhood and mutual commitment are some of the most powerful forces for good that exist in ordinary American life, subscribe to Bike Diaries. We upload a new story every single day, and if this one is reaching you, there are hundreds more waiting. Hit that subscribe button and the like button so more people can find stories like this one. By the middle of March, Gerald Crawford had confirmed attendance from 41 people. By the end of April, that number was 63. Some of them had known Roy Briggs for years and came because Roy was a brother and Roy's kid needed them, full stop. Some of them had never met Roy or Caleb and came because Gerald had told the story, and the story was enough. A handful of them were women, partners, and wives, and members in their own right, who had heard about Caleb through the same channels and decided independently that they were going to be in those seats. One man drove in from Kentucky because his own daughter had aged out of foster care at 18 with no one at her graduation either, and he had never stopped carrying that, and this felt like the closest thing to a repair that the universe had offered him. The one person who knew nothing about any of it was Caleb Driscoll, who was finishing his senior year in the specific mode of endurance that he had developed for surviving the final stretch of things. He was not unhappy. That is important to say clearly, because the story of a kid who has been through 11 foster placements can easily collapse into a single note of unbroken misery, and Caleb's life was not that. He had Roy's garage and the satisfaction of mechanical problems that yielded to understanding. He had 3 books he was reading simultaneously, and a particular corner of the school library where the afternoon light came through at an angle that he had never told anyone he liked, because liking specific things about places felt like a risk he had learned not to take. He had a loose friendship with a kid named Darius from his AP English class who sent him memes about authors they were both pretending to have fully read. He had Connie's cooking, which was not exceptional but was consistent, and consistency had become one of the things Caleb valued most in the world. What he did not have, and what he had quietly, efficiently, completely made his peace with not having, was the graduation experience that the school had been quietly building toward for 12 months. The cap and gown fittings, the rehearsals, the announcements that went home asking families to arrive early for good seats. All of that was noise that belonged to other people's stories. Caleb attended rehearsal on the Wednesday before graduation because it was required, and he was not the kind of person who skipped required things. He sat in the 3rd row of the gymnasium with his classmates while the vice principal explained the processional order and the stage choreography, and he looked at the empty seats that would be full in 48 hours with people who had come for someone, and he did the thing he had always done, which was to locate the feeling of absence, acknowledge it with the brisk efficiency of someone checking a box, and then put it somewhere it would not interfere with function. He didn't notice that Roy and Connie had been unusually quiet for the past 2 months. He noticed things like that eventually, but he had trained himself not to interpret the behavior of adults around him as information about his own situation, because that way lay a particular kind of hope that he had found too expensive to maintain. If Roy seemed distracted some evenings, if Connie occasionally looked at him with an expression that was slightly too warm and then quickly looked away, Caleb filed those observations under things that are probably about other people and moved on. The night before graduation, Roy found Caleb in the garage, not working on anything, just sitting on the stool beside the old cruiser with a book open on his knees that he clearly wasn't reading. Roy came in and sat on the overturned bucket he used when he worked on the floor, and neither of them said anything for a while. The garage had become the place in the Briggs house where the most important conversations happened, and both of them understood this without having discussed it. Roy said eventually, "You ready for tomorrow?" Caleb said, "It's a ceremony. You walk across a stage." Roy said, "Yeah." A pause. Roy said, "You should be proud of yourself, Caleb. 17 years old and you never let any of it stop you. That's not nothing." Caleb looked at him. Roy was looking at the cruiser. His expression was careful in the way expressions are careful when the person wearing them is working to keep something from showing. Caleb almost asked what was behind the careful expression. He decided not to. He said, "Thanks, Roy." Roy nodded. They sat there for another 10 minutes in the particular comfortable silence they had built across 2 years of working side by side on things that needed fixing, and then Caleb went to bed. He did not sleep well. He did not sleep well the nights before things that mattered to him and had learned to pretend didn't matter to him, which was its own kind of tell. He lay in the second bedroom of the Briggs house with the bathroom light on down the hall, the light that Roy had left on every single night for 2 years without once mentioning it. And he stared at the ceiling and told himself the story he always told himself, that it was fine, that tomorrow was just a formality, that walking across a stage and receiving a piece of paper was a mechanical transaction that did not require an audience, that he had everything he needed, that the absence of people in those seats was simply the shape of his life, and he had made peace with that shape, and there was no point in wanting it to be different. He believed about 40% of that, which was actually a lower percentage than usual, and which told him, if he was being honest with himself in the dark of the second bedroom, that 2 years in the Briggs house had done something to his carefully maintained defenses that he had not fully accounted for. Roy and Connie had not tried to fix him or claim him or perform the role of family loudly enough to convince themselves they were doing it. They had just been there, steady and unglamorous and present, and that steadiness had apparently done the quiet work of making him want things he had given up wanting, which was inconvenient, and also, in a way he couldn't quite articulate at 17, something that felt like it might be the first real sign of health he'd had in as long as he could remember. He graduated in the morning. He ironed his own shirt. He found his cap and gown hanging on the back of his door, where Connie had put it the night before so it wouldn't wrinkle. And for a moment he just stood there looking at it, this piece of ceremony that belonged to him, and he felt the complicated weight of being 17 and having come this far by himself, and knowing that coming this far by yourself was both something to be proud of and an indictment of every system that was supposed to make sure you didn't have to. He put on the gown. He looked at himself in the mirror with the level gaze of someone taking inventory. He looked like a kid about to graduate. He looked like a kid who was alone. He looked, if he was being honest, like both of those things at once, and he had never felt the tension between them more sharply than he did in that moment, in that house that had been the closest thing to home he had ever had, getting ready for the day he had worked toward for 13 years of school, with no one to take his picture in the front yard. Roy knocked on his door at that exact moment. Caleb opened it. Roy was dressed in his good clothes, dark jeans and a button shirt, and he was wearing his vest over it, the Cumberland Road Brotherhood leather with the patches that Caleb had spent 2 years learning to identify. Roy looked at him standing there in the cap and gown, and his expression did something complicated and fast that he covered with a short nod. He said, "You look good, kid." Caleb said, "You're wearing your vest." Roy said, "Yeah, I am." Caleb waited for an explanation. Roy didn't offer one. He just said, "Come on, Connie's waiting," and turned back down the hall. The Hartfield High School gymnasium held 480 seats when every folding chair was deployed in the configuration the custodial staff had spent the previous afternoon arranging with the mechanical precision of people who had done this exact thing for many years. By the time the graduates lined up in the hallway outside at 6:45 in the evening, those 480 seats were full. That was not unusual for a graduation ceremony in a small Tennessee town where the graduating class was 83 students, and most families brought everyone they could fit in a vehicle. What was unusual was the front row. The front row of the Hartfield High School gymnasium on the third Thursday of May was occupied entirely by members of the Cumberland Road Brotherhood and their affiliated riders, 63 people in leather vests with patches that caught the gymnasium light, sitting shoulder to shoulder with the particular, settled confidence of people who had somewhere to be and had decided to be there completely. They had arrived 45 minutes early. Gerald Crawford had coordinated the seating with the vice principal's office 2 weeks in advance, explaining the situation in enough detail that the vice principal, a practical woman named Diane Forsyth, who had been running graduation ceremonies for 16 years, had said nothing except, "Front row is yours," and made sure the chairs were saved. Roy and Connie Briggs sat in the middle of that front row. Roy was still wearing his vest. Connie had a small sign in her lap that said, Caleb, in letters she had cut from gold paper and glued to a piece of cardboard the night before, while Roy was in the garage making sure Caleb didn't come into the kitchen and see it. She had made it at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and her reading glasses on, cutting each letter slowly and carefully the way she did everything. And when she was done, she had held it up and looked at it for a moment and felt the specific happiness of a person who is about to give someone something they did not know they were allowed to want. Caleb was not aware of any of this. He was standing in the hallway outside the gymnasium in alphabetical order, between a girl named Dani Cortez, who was whispering her valedictorian speech to herself under her breath, and a boy named Marcus Duval, who was trying to get his graduation cap to stay level on his head and losing the argument. Caleb could hear the gymnasium through the closed doors, the low roar of 480 people settling into seats and finding their people and doing the preliminary social work of an event. He had attended enough school functions in enough different schools to know how that sound worked, what it meant, the particular texture of a room full of people who belonged to each other. He pulled the sleeve of his gown down over his wrist and looked at the floor and told himself, for the last time, that it was fine. The doors opened. The processional music started. 83 graduates began moving in the slow ceremonial shuffle that graduations require, 2 by 2 down the center aisle of the gymnasium, and Caleb moved with them, eyes forward, face arranged in the expression he used for situations that required him to be present without being exposed. He was good at that expression. He had been practicing it for 13 years. He looked at the stage, at the podium, at the banner that said, Hartfield High School Class of the Year in the school colors. He did not look at the seats. He had made a specific decision not to look at the seats because looking at the seats and seeing what he expected to see, which was rows of strangers whose attention was directed everywhere except at him, would make the next 2 hours harder than they needed to be. And he had gotten very efficient at not making things harder than they needed to be. He was 12 steps down the aisle when the sound reached him. Not applause, not yet. Something else. A low, collective sound from the direction of the front row, a kind of directed attention that had a physical quality to it, like the change in air pressure before weather. He looked without meaning to. It was the looking that you do when something in your peripheral vision insists on being seen, the involuntary turn of the head that bypasses the decisions you have made in advance. He looked at the front row. He stopped walking. The girl behind him walked into him gently and said, "Sorry," and he didn't hear it. He was looking at 63 people in leather vests sitting in the front row of his graduation ceremony, and in the middle of them, Roy Briggs, who was looking directly at him with the careful expression that Caleb now understood had not been concealing distraction or concern, but had been concealing this, and beside Roy, Connie, holding a sign with his name on it in gold letters, and around them, filling every chair in that front row from one end of the gymnasium to the other, people he had never met who had come here for him. Someone in the front row started clapping. Then, the person beside them. Then, all 63 of them. And then because 63 people clapping in a gymnasium creates a sound that pulls other sounds into it, the rest of the auditorium joined, 480 people clapping for the processional. But Caleb knew, with the absolute unambiguous certainty of someone receiving information that bypasses the intellect entirely and lands somewhere older and deeper, that the front row was clapping for him specifically. He knew it the way you know things that are true without being able to explain the mechanism. He knew it because Roy was still looking directly at him with that expression that was no longer careful, that had stopped being careful, and had become something open and steady and proud. He knew it because Connie was on her feet now, holding the sign above her head, and the word on it was his name. Caleb Driscoll stood in the middle of the processional aisle of the Hartfield High School gymnasium and did something he had not done in front of other people since he was approximately 6 years old. He cried, not silently, not in the managed, controlled way that he had developed for processing difficult emotions in private. He cried the way people cry when something they stopped believing in walks back into the room, which is to say, completely, and without any of the usual defenses in place, his face doing things he had no control over, his chest doing the uneven heaving thing that happens when the body has been holding something for a very long time and is finally being given permission to put it down. Danny Cortez, the girl beside him, put her hand briefly on his arm. She didn't say anything. She just touched his arm for a second and then looked forward, and that small gesture of witnessed humanity made it worse and better simultaneously in the way that being seen always does. A teacher materialized from the side of the aisle and guided him gently forward, and the processional continued, and Caleb walked to his seat in the graduate section with his face wet and his hands not quite steady, and he sat down in his chair and looked at the front row, where 63 people in leather vests were still there, still real, still present in a way that he was going to have to rebuild his entire internal architecture to accommodate. Gerald Crawford, sitting on the far left of the front row, caught his eye and gave him a single nod. The kind of nod that means we see you and we came and you are not alone, delivered without words because some things are too straightforward for words to improve upon. The ceremony proceeded the way graduation ceremonies proceed, with speeches and acknowledgments and the careful bureaucratic dignity of an institution marking a transition. Caleb heard approximately 30% of it. The rest of his attention was occupied by the process of integrating what was happening, which was taking longer than usual, because what was happening was something he did not have a pre-existing category for. He had categories for absence. He had very sophisticated and well-organized categories for absence. He did not have a category for 63 strangers in a front row, and his mind was working at capacity trying to build one in real time. When they called his name, the front row stood up. All 63 of them on their feet, and the sound they made was not polite graduation applause. It was the sound of people who had driven from 4 counties and gotten on their motorcycles on a Thursday evening and found parking for 63 bikes outside a high school gymnasium because a counselor had made a phone call and a man named Gerald had said, "We'll be there." It was loud in the specific way that intentional sound is loud, which is different from accidental volume. It filled the gymnasium, and it bounced off the rafters, and it followed Caleb up the 3 steps to the stage and across the stage to the principal, who shook his hand with a slightly surprised expression, having not anticipated the volume. Caleb took his diploma and turned to face the auditorium, and the front row was still standing, and Roy Briggs was not doing a good job of keeping his expression flat anymore, and Connie was crying openly and holding the gold letter sign above her head, and the word on it was his name, and his name was being shouted by 63 people who had come here for him. He found out later, in pieces, how it had happened. Margaret Holloway told him about the phone call she had made in February, sitting across from him in her office the Monday after graduation, with her hands folded on her desk and the expression of someone who has done a thing they are quietly proud of. She said, "I hope you don't feel like I overstepped." He said no. She waited. He said, "I don't have the right words for it yet." She said, "You don't need them yet." Roy told him about the conversation with Gerald Crawford, about the chapter presidents and the other clubs and the man who drove from Kentucky. Connie told him about making the sign at the kitchen table with a glass of wine and her reading glasses. Each piece of the story landed differently, accumulated into something that Caleb kept turning over in the weeks after graduation, the way you turn over something valuable that you are still learning the dimensions of. Gerald Crawford introduced himself properly at the reception after the ceremony, a man with a gray-streaked beard and the calm, unhurried manner of someone who had been doing good things long enough to do them without theater. He shook Caleb's hand and said, "Your foster father speaks highly of you. I hear you can diagnose an engine problem by sound," Caleb said, "sometimes." Gerald said, "We've got brothers who could use someone like that at the monthly maintenance days, if you're interested." He said it casually, the way invitations are extended when they are genuine rather than performative, without pressure or expectation, in the manner of a door being left open rather than a door being held open with someone standing in the frame, waiting for an answer. Caleb looked at him for a moment. He said, "Yeah, I might be interested." Gerald nodded and handed him a card and moved on to talk to someone else, and Caleb stood there holding the card and understanding that this was how it had started for Roy too, with something small and practical and real. He showed up at the first maintenance day 3 weeks after graduation in the parking lot of the Cumberland Road Brotherhood Clubhouse on a Saturday morning. There were 14 bikes and 11 people, and someone had brought a cooler with cold drinks, and Gerald Crawford had organized the work into stations with the cheerful efficiency of a former vice principal who had never fully recovered from his administrative instincts. Caleb was given a bike with an idle problem and a set of tools and approximately 30 seconds of instruction before the expectation was clearly established that he would figure out the rest himself, which was the exact right approach for someone who had learned everything worth knowing by working it out with his hands. He had the idle problem diagnosed in 20 minutes. The man whose bike it was, a heavy-set retired paramedic named Phil, who went by the road name Steady, looked at him and said, "You trained under Roy Briggs, didn't you?" Caleb said, "Yeah." Steady nodded like that explained everything, because in that community it did. He went back the following month and the month after that. He learned names and road names and the difference between those two things, which was not a small difference in that world. He learned that the Cumberland Road Brotherhood ran a food drive every November and a kids' bike safety event every spring and an annual ride to a veterans memorial 4 hours away that nobody missed if they could help it. He learned that Gerald Crawford had spent 11 years as a middle school vice principal, before a heart attack at 42 had recalibrated his understanding of what his life was for, and that the community liaison role he now occupied was the best use of every skill he had ever developed. He learned that Bricks, the chapter president, had a son he hadn't spoken to in 6 years and carried that loss with the particular silent weight of things that cannot be fixed, only carried. He learned that communities of people who have chosen each other have a texture different from communities of people who were assigned to each other, a specific quality of voluntary commitment that you can feel when you are inside it. What he was learning, without having the language for it yet, was what belonging felt like from the inside. Not the performed belonging of someone trying to earn their place, not the provisional belonging of someone waiting to be asked to leave, but the real kind. The kind that doesn't require maintenance because it is not contingent on performance. Roy had given him a version of this in the Briggs house, steadily and without announcement, over 2 years in a garage. The Brotherhood was giving him a larger version of the same thing, in a parking lot on Saturday mornings, and the cumulative effect of both was doing something to the internal architecture that Caleb had built to survive his life, something structural and irreversible. It was not demolishing that architecture. He would always carry the knowledge of what it meant to move 11 times, to unpack carefully, to need nothing visibly. That knowledge was part of him, and it had also kept him alive. But it was no longer the only architecture available. There was another structure being built alongside it, made of different materials, and this one had a front row in it. He turned 18 in September, 4 months after graduation. Roy and Connie threw him a small dinner, just the 3 of them and 2 neighbors who had become fond of Caleb over 2 years of watching him exist quietly in their street. Gerald Crawford stopped by with a card that had been signed by 41 members of the Brotherhood, signatures Caleb did not recognize yet but was beginning to learn, and a gift that was practical and perfectly chosen, a set of professional-grade diagnostic tools in a molded case, the kind that said, "We know what you're good at, and we think you should have the right equipment for it." Caleb opened the case and looked at the tools arranged in their precise foam cutouts and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "This is too much," Gerald said. "It's exactly right." Caleb looked at him. Gerald said, "You earned that front row, son. Every year you kept going, every school you transferred into, every time you figured it out alone. That front row was the debt we all owe you, and tools are just the beginning of paying it back." Caleb Driscoll aged out of the foster care system at 18 with a high school diploma, a set of professional tools, a standing invitation to Saturday maintenance days, and 2 people in a house on the edge of Hartfield, Tennessee, who had made it clear without legal obligation or formal arrangement that the second bedroom was still his if he needed it and always would be. He enrolled in a vocational program in automotive technology that fall. Gerald wrote him a recommendation letter. Roy drove him to orientation and shook his hand in the parking lot afterward with both hands, the way you shake someone's hand when a handshake is carrying more than a handshake can technically hold. Connie packed him a cooler of food for his first week that was so thoroughly stocked that his roommate asked if he was expecting some kind of emergency. He said, "No." He said, "Someone just wanted to make sure I had enough." He went back to Hartfield for the Cumberland Road Brotherhood's annual Veterans Ride that October, his first ride as something more than a guest. Gerald had lent him a bike for the day, an older model with a recently serviced engine that ran smooth and responsive under his hands. They rode 4 hours to the memorial and stood in the cold October air while someone read names and the engines cooled behind them. And Caleb stood in the middle of 60 people who had chosen each other and been chosen and thought about the word family, about all the shapes it could take, about how it turned out that family was not a thing you were given or not given at birth, but a thing that could be built slowly and out of unexpected materials, by people willing to show up when showing up was what was needed. He thought about a gymnasium in May, about a front row full of leather vests, about 63 people standing up when his name was called, and Roy's face doing the thing it did when it stopped being careful, and a gold paper sign with his name on it held above someone's head. He thought about a phone call made in February by a woman who had decided that a kid who said it's fine was the kid who needed the most. He thought about a man named Gerald who had said, "We'll be there," with the flat certainty of someone making a promise they intended to keep, and then kept it with 62 other people and 400 miles of highway between them. He thought about the fact that he had mouthed those words to himself in the second bedroom the night before graduation, the old words, "It's fine," and had only believed 40% of them and had been right not to believe the rest. Caleb Driscoll graduated from his vocational program 2 years later and took a job at an automotive shop 20 minutes from Hartfield, close enough to have Sunday dinner at the Briggs house most weeks, close enough to make it to Saturday maintenance days when his schedule allowed, close enough to be findable when someone needed him. He earned his own patches the year he turned 22, after 3 years of prospecting and proving himself by the club's standards, without shortcut or exception. The night they gave him his vest, Gerald Crawford stood beside Bricks at the front of the room, and when Caleb put it on and turned around, Gerald said, "Your front row is right here, son. It always will be." Caleb looked at the room full of people who had chosen him and whom he had chosen back, and he thought about a 17-year-old in a cap and gown telling himself it was fine. And he thought, it is fine. It is more than fine. It is the thing the kid didn't have a category for yet. It is what it looks like when someone shows up. It is what it looks like when enough people decide that a child without a front row is a problem that they personally intend to solve. It is 63 motorcycles in a high school parking lot on a Thursday evening in May, and a woman with reading glasses cutting gold letters at a kitchen table, and a man leaving the bathroom light on every night for 2 years without once mentioning it. It is a front row. It is a name called out loud. It is the sound of people who came because you were worth coming for, and it is the moment you finally, completely, with your whole self, believe them.